Warning: some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. What is a paranormal experience you've had? My family has a cabin next to a lake in Vermont that we spend time at in the summer. One night, while sleeping in the upstairs bedroom, I hear what sounds like someone getting up to go to the bathroom. It was coming from right across the hallway outside my door, so I assumed it was my mom. Usual occurrence. Oddly enough, no lights went on and no bathroom noises. The sound of footsteps just stopped. A minute later, I had this odd feeling that someone was standing at the half-open door to my bedroom, watching me. This feeling went on for minutes until all of a sudden the feeling of someone standing by the door turned into the feeling of someone standing directly over the bed. For the next 5 minutes, I had the terrible feeling that someone/something was looming over me with their face mere inches from mine. The 5 minutes or so seemed to last forever. Suddenly, as soon as the feeling started, it abruptly ended. No retreating footsteps, no noise at all. Whatever it was just gone. The next morning, my family and I are eating breakfast at the table and I still couldn't shake the feeling. Then my sister spoke up and asked, "Mom, what time was it that you got up to go to the bathroom last night? I could hear you up and walking around from the downstairs bedroom." Confused, my mom said that she never got up last night. My brother laughed and said, "Mom, we all heard you." Then my dad piped up and said, "No, your mom never got up." I didn't either. That's when I shared my experience. Freaked everyone out. When I was a kid, I had a dream about my grandfather and he was saying goodbye to me. My mom woke me up to tell me he had just died and I hugged her to let her know that I knew already. She was petrified. I was his favorite grandchild and I miss him every day. Back in 1984, when I was 10 years old, I was out shopping with my mother when she suddenly all but collapsed. Some people and I helped her to a nearby seat, and after a few seconds she turned to me and said, "Your grandmother has died." We went home, a 30-minute drive, and upon arrival she learned that her mother had indeed died half an hour before. To this day it's the only inexplicable thing I've ever witnessed, but I have no doubt in my mind that there was some sort of link between the two of them that was broken that day. My sister and I shared a room when we were tweens, and we both swore that it was haunted. We'd hear strange sounds and see weird stuff out of the corner of our eye. There was also an oppressive feeling of something very wrong once the sun went down. My sister and I were way too old to be afraid of the dark, and we were fine with darkness anywhere else. Eventually, my sister refused to sleep in the room. Mom, of course, didn't think there was any possible way we had ghosts and thought this whole thing was ridiculous, until we went to summer camp. We came gone to this story from our mom. We had been gone for a couple of nights. Our dad was working graveyard, so Mom had the house to herself. She was getting ready for bed and heard laughter from our room. She heard it a few times before it struck her that we weren't there. Mom checked the room and the lights were on. Mom tried to convince herself that she was imagining things and turned the lights off. She heard the laughter again and she went to check again. The lights were on again. Mom instinctively just said, "You kids go to bed." And she didn't hear them anymore. After that, Mom believed us, but we were still kind of stuck with the room. It was an old house that we had while we were saving up for a better place. My sister adopted a cat which helped for some reason, but it was months before the cat would go into our room without flipping out. Like literally ears pinned back, growling, hissing and bolting out of the room like a bullet. We eventually were able to move to a nice home, and even Mom was too happy to leave. No one ever believes me when I tell this story, but whatever. Back when I was in early 2000s, I went to Mexico with my ex and his family. We went 18 hours into Mexico to visit his sisters-in-laws. When we got there, it was a weird experience for me because I'm black and most people in their town had never seen anyone non-Mexican in their entire lives. To say strangers were interested would be an understatement. The third night I was there, I awoke to a feeling I was being watched. I turned over and saw an old Mexican woman staring at me, but not in a malicious way, more like curious or amused like everyone else. At first I thought it was my ex's Mill since we were staying at her house, so I called out to her in Spanish but she didn't answer, and after a few moments, I realized I could see through her. Eventually she walked out the room and I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep but I couldn't. The next morning I told my ex's sister what happened and she says, "Oh, you saw her?" I'm like, "Pardon the fuck?" And she goes on to tell me that while she's never seen La Vieja, her husband has a couple of times. And the last time he saw her, she almost led him to his death. She tells me that one night a few years ago, they were once again visiting his mother and staying in her house. In the middle of the night, her husband wakes up to the feeling he's being watched. He sees a woman that looks a lot like his mother standing in the doorway. He calls out to her, asking why she's awake at this hour, but she doesn't answer. Instead, she walks out of the room and eventually goes outside. Half asleep and in a trance, he follows, calling out to her again and again with no answer. SN. His mother's house is located in the valley between two mountains and is so isolated she still draws her water from a well in her front yard. So, my ex's Bill is following this woman thinking it's his mother and eventually follows her outside. He runs after her and sees her jump directly into the well. Panicked, he begins to jump and thinking he is saving his mother from drowning. But the moment before he jumps in the well, he fully awakes and realizes there's no splash and the water at the bottom was completely still. If he would have jumped in he would have drowned. They have no neighbors and everyone else in the house was asleep. No one would have heard him scream for help. Needless to say, I packed my shit and went home early. Fuck that. I used to see a little boy in the corner of my room mostly at nighttime when I was about 13 yo. I could see and sense that he wasn't a living human being and his clothes were really old-fashioned. I was never really scared because he always had a positive energy around him, can't really explain it. I talked to him sometimes and he told me his name etc. Can't really remember any of the things he told me anymore. But the most interesting thing happened during a fight between me and my mom. My cousin and her mother were visiting us at the moment and I had never told them about this boy, since ghosts aren't really a light discussion over dinner kind of thing. At some point I had had enough of the fight and got out, slammed the door behind me and for some reason went to a parking garage under our house to chill and cool down for a few hours. My mom, cousin and aunt went looking after me and eventually found me. My cousin told me that she had got the idea to look from the parking garage after she had seen a young blonde boy with weird clothes standing by a fence that was right next to a door to the garage. She told me that the boy just stood there and when he got her attention he jumped over the fence and disappeared. Only that behind the fence there was a thick bush full of big thorns and there is no way a little boy would have just jumped in it and let alone not make a sound after getting stabbed by the thorns. I guess my friendly ghost wanted to help. Only a few people believe me when I say that my old house is haunted. Instead of writing a long story, I'm just going to bullet point things that have happened to me or anyone else in the house. My sister has seen a shadow of a child. My older sister, who didn't believe in the paranormal, started screaming at around 3 a.m. She was hysterical. She said that there was a maid in her room just watching her and the maid lunged towards her. I've been breathed on and it petrified me. My baby sister used to have full conversations with nobody. My family went out for the day and as we got back, the neighbor pulled us over to her and asked why my baby sister was laughing so much. My mother asked what she meant and the neighbor says Natalie was laughing really loud earlier and for quite a while. I was laughing at her laughing. My mother then told her that we had been out all day and the house was empty. My sister and I were alone in the house when we heard a thud from upstairs. We went into the room where the thud was and it was freezing cold. Then out of nowhere, the TV remote control flew off the sideboard and hit the wall. The back of it and the batteries flew in different directions when it smashed. Me and my sister ran downstairs and after building some courage for a while, decided to go back up. We got in the room and the remote was back on the sideboard, fixed. All pets have mysteriously died in that house and the longest lasting one was 6 months. 6 rats, a rabbit, 2 hamsters and a cat, all dead, not at the same time. Candles always fell from the positions and onto the floor. One room was always freezing and electrical always turned on by themselves in that room. A constant feel of someone watching you. The master bedroom was always thumping, creaking and causing insomnia. My baby sister started sleep talking but it wasn't in her voice, it was a deep, scary voice. It would always be questions like "Are you alright?" She began sleepwalking and watching one of my other sisters as she slept. It was only that one older sister, never anyone else. A wardrobe in one of the rooms would always open during the night on its own. There is a photograph of my baby sister staring at a streak of light. The light wasn't there when the picture was developed. I began researching the house and it turns out that the land the house stands on, used to be an old children's home which was closed due to negligence and lack of care for the children, could explain the little girl's laugh, the maid and the shadow of a boy. There's so many things to list that I can't describe. I was always skeptical about the paranormal until I moved into that house. I am now a 100% firm believer. I never want to go back in that house again. When I was around 13 I started getting a bad feeling around our house. There were certain areas I refused to go into and I was terrified to close my eyes at night. I was always a nervous child, but this went far beyond that. There are a few incidents of note and I'm going to share them in the order I remember them in. I was having a Skype call in my room with a friend and at some point I left the room with the video chat still on facing a somewhat shiny section of my bed frame. When I came back my friend looked shaken. I asked him what had happened and he explained that he'd seen a face pass by in the reflection while I was gone. We checked to see if there was any way to move the camera to where it showed his own face and we couldn't find one. While looking for a game I'd lost, I went up into the bonus room of our house. For reference, this was a room above the garage disconnected from the rest of the house except through the narrow laundry room. I hated going up there. In most cases I refused because it gave me the most horrible feeling. Some of my friends said even just going into the laundry room made them uncomfortable. After searching for a few minutes I lost my nerve and went to head back down the stairs and get out of there. As I was heading down the stairs I froze, an icy feeling in my gut, and started to turn around. Before I could I felt the distinct impression of hands on my back shoving me. I just barely caught the handrail before I went tumbling and ran out of there like a bat out of hell. After the previous incident, I decided to put a line of salt down in the laundry room. I figured it couldn't hurt and it'd be a good test to see if anything was actually happening or if I was just spooking myself. I put the salt down and the very next day the feeling of dread had already dulled throughout the house. I could relax, at least somewhat, and the stuff that had been happening stopped. Until I came home one day and the feeling was back worse than it had ever been. My parents had hired a cleaner who had swept up the laundry room. I was terrified of what might happen next, but couldn't bring myself to get that close to the source again. Not long after this, I started getting the same feeling I got from the bonus room in my own room. I could feel it coming distinctly from one corner of my room. I don't know how long it was there, but eventually I got used to it. I thought again that maybe I was just scaring myself. One night I laid down and closed my eyes and after a little bit, as I was starting to drift off, my body tensed. I couldn't move or open my eyes as that feeling from the corner of my room got stronger and stronger. I felt a dip in the bed at my side and for a moment nothing happened. I thought that maybe if I pretended to be asleep whatever it was would go away. And then suddenly the feeling of hands was back and around my throat. I couldn't breathe, but I also couldn't move. My lungs burned, tears were rolling down my face, and I could feel myself starting to pass out. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't move a muscle until I finally fell asleep. The next day when I looked in the mirror, there was bruising all around the front and sides of my neck. I was grateful wearing collars was my thing so that no one was suspicious about me wearing a thick one for a week until the bruises were gone. I threw salt absolutely everywhere in my room after that. One night my sister and I saw a black figure poke its head around a wall in our house looking at us. We were the only ones home. There were times I would hear children laughing when none were around. I've heard muffled voices coming from our TV when it was turned off. After I moved out of our house my mom and sister woke up to one of the dining room chairs pushed up to the kitchen sink like someone who couldn't reach the sink would need. A few days before I had my daughter my grandmother had emergency surgery and didn't wake up from it until a week later. She never really recovered from it, but did tell some of my cousins that she died when my daughter was born and then said she saw us driving home from the hospital. She had details she couldn't possibly know. She died a month after I had my daughter. Everyone in our family knows that when you die, you let everyone alive know you are okay. People get visited in dreams. I was visited by both grandmothers and my sister was visited by our grandfather. They are very different from dreams and have left us very shaken and comforted. I've posted this previously on threads that have either not gained traction, or in places where it got buried. So my parents' second house had some oddities in the first years after we had moved into it. All but one event and a shop vac happened to my mother. I don't recall all of the stories, as most of them were either pretty minor or can be reasonably debunked, but here are the important ones. 1. I think this one was the first to happen, and the only one that my dad also witnessed. That is, if you count hearing something as witnessing it. We had a shop vac perched atop a freestanding shelf in the laundry room. Now the laundry room was directly next to my parents' bedroom in such a way that the washer and dryer were directly on the other side of the wall from their bed. Exactly how we had the washer, dryer, and shelves arranged I don't know, because shortly after this we took apart the shelves and stored them elsewhere for unrelated reasons. However, the shop vac was atop it, and the washing machine somewhere nearby. My mother usually keeps the lid to the washing machine open at night to let it air out. My parents heard this crash one night as they were falling asleep, and got up to find out what it was. It sounded like it was in the laundry room, so they went to check it out. The shop vac had somehow managed to land in the washing machine. Now, It was positioned on the shelf in such a way that there was no reasonable means for it to fall off of the shelf, as everything was pretty stable and there was no angle or anything that could cause it to slide. I know because they tested it and tried to place it on the shelf in such a way that it could become unstable, but it didn't happen. This was the only poltergeist activity to occur. 2. My mother often sleeps on the living room couch. The living room of that house is situated in such a way that my bedroom and the spare room are off of one wall and the doorway to the rest of the house, including the bathroom, is on the other. One night, my mother heard me walking across the living room, presumably to go to the bathroom, except that I wasn't walking across the room, but it sounded like I was going in circles around the rocking chair that's near the entrance to the hallway. My mother called my name, asking what I was doing. She got no answer. She kept calling name, becoming increasingly frustrated with me because I didn't say anything. Eventually, she turned on the light. Nothing was there. She checked on me. I was asleep. 3. On another occasion, my mother felt footsteps behind the couch. The couch wasn't up against the wall, and there was a walkable-sized area between the back of the couch and the front window. The thing is, she didn't hear the footsteps, only felt the weight of someone pacing back and forth. She said, "Can you stop it? I'm trying to sleep," and the footsteps stopped. 4. This one is not directly connected to the house itself, but is still creepy nonetheless. It also didn't technically happen to anyone in the house. My grandma called one day. She said, "Did you just call me a minute ago?" My mom hadn't. Grandma then continued to explain how she had just gotten a call from us, and when she answered, nobody was on the other end of the line. However, she could hear everything that was happening in the house. My dad was watching TV, my mother was vacuuming the rug, and both of my parents were arguing over something at the same time. She could also hear me playing whatever computer game I was into at the time, probably either Warcraft 3 or SimCity 4. On top of all this, she said that she heard a sound like paper being folded right next to the phone. Now, I've delved pretty deep into the creepy/spooky AskReddit collection on r/copypasta, and I've seen other stories of odd phone calls that involve a fabric folding noise happening in the foreground. The strangest part of all this is that it just happened to occur on the exact same day that my mom's aunt had died. 5. This one is my story, and it only took place within the last few years of my family living there, instead of the first. I had woken up before, though I cannot say how many times, by the voice of a little girl saying hello. I usually thought nothing of it, attributing it to the random nonsense generated by my brain while asleep. The thing is, on the few occasions that it occurred, the voice was the same, none of it was relevant to the dream, and it always woke me up. The one night, it giggled a sort of hey hey. 2 abrupt notes, the second being of slightly higher pitch than the first. The kicker is, I wasn't really asleep for that one. I was trying to restlessly fall asleep, but had not gotten into it yet. It's on my bucket list now to see a ghost, but as of yet, I've only ever heard one. 6. This last story is probably the least supernatural of all of them, but my mother nonetheless insists that it is. It was the last week that we would be living in the house, and my mother was cleaning the baseboards in the kitchen as she always had many times before. By baseboards, I mean these metal heating vents that rely on propane. While my mom was cleaning, she came across a piece of paper. She figured that it must have been something that recently fell back there, as had happened on occasion, since the place where we kept business cards and such was right next to this spot. She pulls it out and it's a picture of the previous owners of the house with some other relative of theirs. I think it was their cousin or someone. My mom found this odd, considering how she had cleaned back there for 9 years at this point, and only ever found this picture within the last week of living there. She gave it to the previous owners who were at the time living next door. They, of course, gave her the context of the photo, and that there was nothing unusual about it. It was just a picture of them next to some relative or other. Before you ask, no, the photo had not been taken after we moved in. That perhaps would have convinced me, but the fact there was nothing spooky about the photograph itself leaves me skeptical about it. Still, my mother thought it was the spirit's way of saying goodbye. With the exception of the last 2 stories, the weird stuff was only after semi-recently moving into the house. After we moved out, my mom wondered if the new owners ever ran into the walking around ghost, or the little girl, whom I had named Charlotte. Here's a bonus story that hadn't been included the previous times that I posted this, in part because I didn't have all of the details correct until I asked my mother about this story again fairly recently. 7. Or, rather, number 0, as this occurred before all of the aforementioned stories. My mother used to work part-time as a substitute lunch monitor at a school that was near where we used to live before moving into the house mentioned above. She used to commute to the school by walking nearly the entire length of a massive cemetery. Technically it was more than one right next to each other. She would travel from its northeast corner to the school near its southwest one. I'll even link the location here, since I no longer live in the area. If you zoom out, look around, etc., you can see just how big it is. Heck, the throughway cuts through it. Anyway, the story is that during one of her commutes, she found the entire ground to be black with crows. They were everywhere, as far as you could see. My mom didn't think much of this, as they mostly just hopped out of her way as she walked down the road shown above. What she didn't think about until later was the fact that not a single one of them was making a sound. 8. On a different day, and I had originally thought the above story to have happened at the same time as this one, but my mother corrected me. She was walking through the same cemetery in early spring when she noticed a young girl in the distance, wearing a dress. She found it upsetting that someone would leave their young child unattended in a cemetery in clothing that would leave her a bit cold. At least give her a jacket or something. We later found out from someone who knows the story better that the girl's name is Annabelle, and that she is commonly seen around crows. In fact, if anyone else is familiar with this particular spirit, I'd like to know more, but have been unable to find anything other than the fact that she likes to ride in the back seats of people's cars. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more daily videos, and join the Spooky Squad.